The Samaritans were outsiders in the Judaism of Jesus' day, as you probably remembered from the last two episodes. And the best known of Jesus' references to the Samaritans is in a short fiction known as the parable of the Good Samaritan. And Jesus taught in parables for many reasons. For one thing, it was a time-honored method of teaching in Judaism. There are many parables in the Old Testament. The Jews were used to that method of teaching. Another reason, presenting truths in story form, made it more accessible to people, easier to remember. In short, we listen to stories because they grab our attention, and listeners want to know how they turn out. And they were mostly listeners in these days. The number of people who could read and write hung around 5 to 10%, usually the wealthy who could afford to be educated. The parable of the Good Samaritan, because of how well known it is, has been analyzed and interpreted over the years in many ways, some helpful and some not. And one of the unhelpful and sometimes misleading ways is interpreting it as an allegory, where every character, city, body of water, and a tree stump represents something different than its clear and obvious meaning. It's overthinking. It's overanalyzing. There's more to say about this. But first, the parable itself. This is recorded in the 10th chapter of Luke's Gospel, and right before the parable itself begins, Jesus has a conversation with a lawyer. A note here, some translations may say simply lawyer, and this can be misleading to us in our day. This was a lawyer, not of civil law, not of criminal law, but of religious law. So one day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus replied with a question of his own. What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it? Well, the lawyer answered, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now that lawyer was quoting directly from the law of Moses from two different verses in Deuteronomy. Correct, Jesus told him. Do this and you will live. Now, in introducing this retelling of this conversation, Luke makes a point of letting us know that the lawyer was testing Jesus. And this was a test. The lawyer went on. And who's my neighbor? Neighbor had always meant to the Jew, a fellow Jew. So it's no wild flight of imagination to think that what the lawyer was really asking was, who isn't my neighbor? Who don't I have to love as myself? Jesus often answered a question with another question, but this time he answered with a story, with a parable. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho. The road was 18 miles long, and it did go down about 3,200 feet. The man fell among robbers who beat him and left him naked and half dead. The steep and mountainous road was notorious for such things, and we might think of it as the rough equivalent of a dark alley in a big city in the middle of the night. Now a priest came down this road as well, followed by a Levite, and both passed him by. Now, the normal explanation for their not tending to the man was that they believed him to be dead, and touching a dead body would have made them both ritually unclean and unable to perform their religious duties. That may be true, but the theme of this parable is loving your neighbor, and that is not the kind of point that Jesus would have made. It's more likely that the issue being raised here was that these were religious officials putting their religious duties ahead of their duties to their neighbor, because it was for precisely this kind of callous behavior that Jesus frequently criticized the Pharisees. The third man came along was a Samaritan, a people whom the Jews despised and would have nothing to do with. And when this Samaritan saw the man, he had compassion on him. A Samaritan would not have any reason to consider a Jew a neighbor, so seeing past this long-standing cultural stereotype makes what the Samaritan man did next remarkable. He bound up his wounds after pouring oil and wine on them. The wine would have acted as a crude antiseptic, and the oil had a spiritual significance. He put the injured Jew on his own animal and took him to an inn and took care of him. He gave the innkeeper some money to cover any other expenses and promised to come back and take care of any other costs that had arisen. When Jesus had finished the story, he asked the lawyer, "So, which man proved to be a neighbor to the injured man?" "Well," said the lawyer, "the one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "Yes, now you go and do the same." This was a simple tale of mercy shown to a helpless man by another man who had no reason to be merciful. One man helping another man who could have been his enemy under normal circumstances. A story about a Samaritan going well beyond what would have been expected of him in that time and place. It is a story about overwhelming generosity of time, money, and caring. It is a story whose moral cannot be improved by making it an allegory. Making the Samaritan into Christ, or the injured man into Adam, or turning Jerusalem into paradise and Jericho into an evil and uncaring world, or the inn into the church, or the innkeeper into the church leaders, all of which are ingredients in this allegorical interpretation. None of them make the point of this story any clearer. In fact, I think it muddies it. Writers of allegories talk down to an audience, telling them they can't possibly get the point unless I explain it to you. You should appreciate and be grateful for my brilliance. What they don't appreciate is this story is brilliant just as it is. We don't ponder things we believe we understand. We dismiss them as just another solved problem. It is the gray areas in life that keep us thinking about what meaning is. It is the mystery that pushes us forward, not certainty. Over time, certainty can become a kind of arrogance. Faith is a bit of mystery and should be. Parables are not meant to be problems that we solve and never think about again, like a stopped-up sink or a dead car battery replaced. These stories are ones that we come back to again and again. Changes in our lives allow us to see new things in them. The parable of the Good Samaritan is called an exemplary parable. It sets an example for us. It asks questions of us. It challenges our assumptions about the way things are and the way they could be. We call this parable the one about the Good Samaritan. We've called it that for centuries. But those words don't actually appear in the parable itself. Yet the very name suggests that a Good Samaritan was unusual, that the other Samaritans were not good. So the very title that we've given this story challenges our thinking about how we judge people that we've never met. We sometimes insert ourselves into the stories that we read, and we may do this with this one. What if we were the Samaritan character in this one? Would we have done what he did? What if we were one of the two religious figures that looked the other way? Would we have regretted it later? What if we'd been the innkeeper? What if we were the injured man and realized that we were rescued and our life possibly saved by a man who our culture and history called us to hate? How would that have affected us? How would that have changed us? Would it have changed you? I'm very interested in knowing what you think about this, so please feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments section. So, it's not enough for us to read a parable, come up with some tight explanation about the meaning, and move on. These are stories we can't really understand unless we put ourselves in them, inhabit them. And this is the way Jesus taught. Why, he often answered a question with yet another question, or in this case, a story. Jesus provoked his listeners into doing their own thinking and coming up with their own answers. How many parables of Jesus were there? 30, 40, 50? Yes, a specific number is difficult to come up with because not every parable is preceded by a signpost that says, "Attention, this is a parable." For instance, the story of the rich man and Lazarus is never proclaimed to be a parable, so some believed it to be a true account. And by that measure, though, the Good Samaritan was never stated to be a parable. Myself, I believe that any story that makes us think on a deeper level than the story itself is worth retelling. And if that is the measure of a story that deserves to be retold, then the next story fits the bill. It is a parable about King David with an audience of one. King David himself. But that is for another day. So please like or subscribe if you found this worth your while. More valuable to me on a personal level is what you think. So please take the time to comment. I hope to see you next week.